All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse. I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for our first time, and we do have a family joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms and homes around the world. Today is a heavy dose of adventure, and I am really excited to get us started. So last week, we were joined by Kendall, highlighting some of his amazing dive expeditions around the world. Today, he is back to focus on one expedition in particular, a very, very special project where he got to explore the Mars Warship. This is the largest warship in the world back when it was built, and it was sunk in a naval battle in 1564 and lay beneath the waves for almost 450 years before being discovered in 2011. Hopefully my math's right on that. It's close. Yep. Anyway, so John was part of the team that excavated it and has sought to explore it and highlight all the amazing story of this incredible ship. So he's going to share that with us today. And so let's dive in, literally and figuratively. John, thank you so much for joining us, and take us away.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. Yep. I want to talk to you about a little bit about the history of the Mars shipwreck, and then some about the project that we've been doing on it. So let me just share my screen here, and here we go. So Mars, or Mars the Magnificent. This is the name of the ship. So before I start immediately on Mars, some of you won't have seen last week, so I'm going to give you a very quick thing about me. I've been scuba diving for 27 years now. So I started when I was at school, started scuba diving, and these days I earn my living by teaching people how to do high-level scuba diving. So going deep, going into caves, exploring, all that kind of stuff. And I'm a member of a fellow of the Explorers Club of New York. A few things. Here's some cave diving. This is the kind of stuff I do. A lot of what I do, I take a camera with me, so I'm taking a lot of photos and building a lot of imagery of the places I go. This is actually a photo of me, a fairly rare photo of me with a 3D scanning rig designed for scanning underwater cave systems. And I'm going to talk a bit about 3D scanning today with the Mars project. Occasionally I get the opportunity to dive around the submarines. These are really cool. Means we can bring scientists down to the dive sites so they can see what we're seeing, so the dive team can do the work whilst they can oversee us. So that was a very quick introduction about me, and now I'm going to get into the bit that I really like. I'm going to be talking about a place called the Baltic Sea. So the Baltic Sea is in Northern Europe, and it's kind of in the middle between Sweden and Finland and Germany and Poland and Estonia, with Russia over to the side and Denmark over to the other side, and Norway kind of getting in there as well. So here's a map, a very old map of the Baltic Sea, and it's this chunk of sea in the middle here. And this down here is Denmark, and this up here is modern day Sweden. And as you can see, if you want to be a seafaring trade nation and you want to take your ships from Sweden out to the rest of the world, you've basically got to pass through this very narrow gap between Denmark and Sweden. And in the 16th century, basically Denmark wasn't just to the left of this channel. Denmark was kind of in control of most of this area here and quite a lot of what is now Sweden. So the southern end of what is now Sweden. And in the early to mid 16th century, one of the Swedish dukes, one of the dukes from Sweden, a guy called Gustav Vasa, decided that enough was enough, and he teamed up with a lot of the other dukedoms in Sweden and created the first kingdom of Sweden. And so he joined together, instead of having all of these small dukedoms and city-states, it became this larger territory, this kingdom of Sweden. And this was kind of working pretty well. It was upsetting the Danish a bit. But really, it was when Gustav Vasa died and his son Erik took over. So this is Erik the 14th of Sweden. The 14th is something that he gave himself. He was the second king of Sweden because his father, Gustav, was the first king of Sweden. So Erik is now the second king of Sweden. And that's it, really. I don't know why he gave himself the 14th. I think it was just to give himself the gravitas and the concept of being kind of given, by the grace of God, he's there. So we've got Erik the 14th, and he was a very odd chap. He was very Machiavellian. He decided he didn't really want to be loved. He wanted to be feared. And he really didn't like the Danish stranglehold on the Baltic Sea. So he decided to do something about this. So he put together some land armies who started pushing south and started attacking the Danish from the north. He built castles to protect themselves from the Danes. But at the same time, he built a fleet of, or he acquired a fleet of ships. So he went around, he acquired all these ships. And he managed to scrape together quite a few ships, but they were all a bit old. And he decided he needed something new, something modern. And he commissioned the largest warship ever built at this point in time. He decided that he needed a symbol to show his strength and his might. So this massive, great big warship that that he built, or he had built. And the big thing, the really interesting thing about this ship, and this was the Mars, was that it was the first ship ever built from the ground up as an artillery vessel. So prior to Mars, a lot of ships had cannon. Most of the warships had cannon, but they weren't really about the cannon. The ships had cannon to protect themselves or to try and disable other ships. Really what it was about was you'd have the two ships, they'd come together, they'd send grapples over, you'd send your Marines over onto the enemy ship and hand-to-hand combat and take over the ship. Eric the 14th, his plan was, no, let's not do that. Let's just try and sink the other ships. We don't care about trying to capture them. Let's just sink them. So this is basically what we've got. We've got the Swedish fleet with 37 ships and 5,000 soldiers. And then the Danish and Lubeck. Lubeck was a German city-state who had teamed up with the Danish for this. Between them had 33 ships, but had almost 6,500 soldiers. So they had a lot more soldiers because the Danish and the Lubeckians were still thinking about this in the historic method of, attack the ships from close range and then try and capture them. Whereas the Swedish plan was, let's sink the opposing ships from long range with our cannons. So not only did the Swedish fleet have the role of trying to sink the Danish fleet, they were also trying to head down into northern Germany to try and rent a mercenary army. So the Swedish fleet had on board a war treasury. So this means that there was a lot of silver and a lot of gold on board the Mars, because that was the admiral's ship. And the idea was they were going to head into northern Germany and try and rent an army who could then come up from the south of Denmark, whilst the Swedish forces were coming down from the north in a pincer movement and try and beat the Danes. And this all kind of kicked off on May the 30th, 1564. So we've just passed the anniversary of the battle that Mars was involved in here. And as Mars came into view, so the two fleets kind of started sailing, they started seeing each other, and the Danish fleet saw Mars, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing. They knew that there was a new ship. They had, they knew about this, but they couldn't believe the size of her. She was probably 30 to 40% bigger than any other ship in the Danish Navy. And the first thing that Mars did is took sight of one of the Danish fleets, fired her cannon, and sank this ship, the Der Alte Bark, or the Long Bark. Depending on which set of historic notes you look at, it's either the Old Bark or the Long Bark. The Danish kind of downplayed how important it was. The Swedish obviously upplayed how important it was. But needless to say, this was not cricket. This was not the way things were done. The gentlemanly thing was that you perform as everyone expects. But the Swedish were not being gentlemen here. They had gone in, they sunk an enemy ship from a long range with their big cannon. And I should mention the cannon for Mars here. So it is... A lot of the ships in this battle on both sides had cannon, and most of those cannon would have been basically recovered from castles, recovered from terrestrial sites. So you'd have some cannon around a castle, and you'd then take some of them away and put them on the ship. Every single cannon on board Mars was custom made for Mars, and most of them were bronze. We've estimated there were 122 cannon on board the Mars, and 8 of them were iron. So the rest of them, that's 114 cannon, were all made of bronze. Now that's a lot of bronze, particularly being that some of these cannon were 16 feet long and they weigh in at, well, it's 2.5 metric tons. That's a lot of bronze for each of these cannon. Not all of the cannon were that big. Some of them were only 5 feet long, but a lot of bronze needed. And in order to make the cannon for this ship, Eric the 14th basically sent raiding parties around Sweden, and they recovered the bells, the church bells from every single church in Sweden, and had them melted down to make the cannons for Mars. So that's a pretty big undertaking. Now, on May the 31st, so at the end of May the 30th, as night falls, the battle stops. It is, as I understand it, very hard to fight a naval battle when you're on sailing ships. You're firing cannon. You have no GPS. You have no navigation. You don't really know where you are. Doing that at night is almost impossible. You're more likely to start attacking one of your own ships than the enemy ship. So they didn't fight at night. So the end of the 30th of May, the Swedish kind of retreat to their zone. The Danish retreat to their zone. The Swedish are all pumped up because they're winning this battle. They sunk the ship. They're definitely winning this battle. They're going to succeed in their mission. And the Danish, they're very much low energy, disappointed. They're a bit scared. They're not really sure what's going on. Morale is very low. So the morning of May the 31st, as the sun rises over the next day for the battle, and one thing has changed. And what has changed is the wind. So on May the 30th, the wind was behind the Swedish fleet. So it was pushing the Swedish fleet gently towards the Danish fleet. And it's quite easy to sail a ship when the wind is mostly behind you. Unfortunately, on the 31st of May, the wind was coming the other way. So now the wind was coming from behind the Danish fleets, coming up towards the Swedish fleet. And most of the Swedish fleet were quite old. They weren't the latest in technology. The Mars was the absolute latest technology, but most of the rest of the fleet was not. And unfortunately, that meant that the rigging and the sails on the ships were not really suitable for moving the fleet towards the Danes very quickly. Mars, being the latest technology, the latest in rigging and sails, was able to sail closer to the wind. So Mars could still progress towards the Danish fleet. And basically that's what Mars did. Started progressing towards the Danish fleet, carried on fighting. But unfortunately, the mathematics has turned, because now, rather than having 36 ships versus about 30 ships, we've got one ship, the Mars, versus the whole of the Danish fleet. And that just doesn't work. It doesn't matter how big Mars is, how good she is, how many cannons she's got. There's only so much incoming cannon fire that one ship can take before, unfortunately, she had to surrender. So the Danish fleet surrounded her. Her rigging was on fire. There's basically nothing more she could do. And the Danish ships came in and sent the Marines over, and the Mars had to capitulate. So the Danish ships came in, they locked on with the grappling hooks, they sent their Marines over, and the Swedes surrendered. The officers from the Swedish ship, from the Mars, were taken on board the Danish ship, and a Danish boarding party was put onto the Mars to both loot and then sail the ship back to Denmark. So that was the plan. But as I said, the reason that Mars had to stop fighting was that she was on fire. And then at some point, the forward powder store, the forward magazine, caught fire. And this is basically where all of the gunpowder that they would use to fire the cannons was stored. And when that forward magazine caught fire, basically what happened is the front half of the ship blew up. The main mast went 400 feet straight upwards, and the rest of the ship disappeared. As the ship sank so quickly that all of the cannon, these red hot bronze cannon hitting the water, generated a massive, great big steam cloud. The Danish report of the soul of the Mars ascending to the heavens in a cloud of steam, and as the steam settled, there was no ship left. And that was it. That was the end, basically the end of the battle in May 31st, 1564. The rest of the Swedish fleet at this point, when they saw Mars had gone, they retreated and headed back into Sweden. And that was kind of the last of the big naval battles between Denmark and Sweden in this period. And that's it. That was all that anyone had heard of about the Mars for hundreds of years. And we skip forwards to the late 20th century. and my very good friend Richard. So Richard is from Sweden. He lived in Sweden, and he grew up as I did on reading adventure stories and things like Tintin's treasure ships, and I love the idea of a shark-shaped submarine. One day that will be mine. But he basically, as a child, went to a museum in Sweden, a naval museum, and they had this big map on the wall of Sweden and the Baltic Sea, and on the map were marked lots of wreck locations, and then there was a list of historically important ships from Swedish history. And being an attentive chap, he was looking at the map and he was looking at the list, and he was looking at the map and looking at the list, and he realized that on the list there were 2 ship names that did not appear on the map itself. So the list had them and the map did not. And one of these was the Mars. And this kind of started him thinking, and he asked questions about the Mars and discovered about the story of the battle. And that's kind of really excited. This technologically advanced ship was still overcome and sunk, mostly due to a change in the weather. And he spent 20 years hunting for the Mars. Literally, he and his brothers, they bought themselves a side scan, they got a boat, they went out and they were searching for it and didn't find it. And then they started doing some commercial work with it, with the side scan. And every time they got more money in, they'd spend it on better side scan, and they'd go out and carry on scanning for the Mars. And they kept not finding it, kept not finding it, not finding it. And over a 20-year period, they didn't find the Mars. They found 160 plus other shipwrecks, which they explored and documented and looked at, but they didn't find the Mars. But then in 2011, he teamed up with some other people who had a nicer boat and some more expensive side scan gear, and they decided they were going to do a project to try and find the Mars. So off they went out into the Baltic, and they're scanning. But the weather was not being very nice to them, and so instead of scanning, like surveying the way that they normally would, they had to survey in a different direction because of the weather. And partway through the survey, they saw this that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there. If anyone has seen any side scan data, that is not something that is natural. Side scan data is normally quite smooth, and you get some rocks. What you see there is something unusual. So obviously they needed to work out what it was. So they made a mark of where it was, and then the next day they sent in the divers to have a look. And this is what the divers found. They found an almighty great big warship. They could tell it was a big warship because it had lots and lots of very big cannon on board. Some of which still poking out through the cannon ports here, the gun ports. More cannons, just big cannons everywhere. And they identified the ship because of some of the markings on some of the cannons. They found the shield of the House of Vassar molded into one of these bronze cannon, and underneath the markings XIIII. Now, for anyone who knows Roman numerals, you know that XIIII isn't correctly formatted syntax. But it turns out that this is how Eric liked to show the Eric the 14th was XIIII, and I think it's simply because it looked bigger than XIV. But they found a cannon with its markings on it, and they took that to a Swedish cannon expert, not the entire cannon, but some of the images, and said, if we found a cannon with these markings, what would that mean? The cannon expert basically said, well, there's only one ship in the entire history of Sweden that would have those markings, but you can't have found that, that those cannons don't exist because we've never found that wreck. Well, what ship would that be? The answer was the Mars. So then after a little bit of legal wrangling and some other stuff, the team went to the government and basically told the government that they had found the Mars in return for being allowed to be the dive team who do the research. So that was 2011, and the team has been diving the site since 2011. We normally do about 2 weeks per year. I joined the project in about 2015. And this is some of the imagery from the project. So here you can see my good friend Alex and one of these cannon. Notice that on his arm he has this yellow stick with black markings on it. That's actually a scale ruler. So every diver is carrying at least one of these with them, so that when we take photos of the archaeology that we find, we can get it to scale. So you can see here one of the divers measuring one of the cannon. We measured the bore of the cannon as well. So one of the things we're looking at is trying to work out how big these cannon were, how big a shot they would fire. But there was also a theory that we were told that said that for all of the ships on Mars, the bore versus the trundle. Am I still online? Yeah. Yeah, we are. Sorry, it's just my window disappeared and then it came back. Yeah, the bore, which is the hole down the middle, the size, the diameter of the cannon, versus the trunnion arm. So the trunnion arm is the spike that comes out of either side of the cannon that allows it to pivot on its cradle. So on Mars, these are all the same. That's the theory. So one of the things that we've been testing is measuring the bore and the trunnion arm on these cannons, and so far the theory is holding up. This is actually unusual, that this doesn't seem to exist on any other ship or anywhere else in the world. So it's kind of unusual. But again, it helps promote the fact that this was Mars. Here's an awesome little photo. I love this photo. So this is an area of the wreck that I like to call the engineer's cabin. I don't know why, it's just what I think. We have a cannon here. So you can see this, the back of a cannon. It is still sat on its cradle. And then you see these here, these sheets. These are actually lead. They're rolls of lead sheeting. Now, we don't really know what the lead sheeting was for. It could have been for repairing bits of the ship. It could be lead that's been put in that position in order to make lead shot for the muskets and things for as weaponry for the ship. Again, we don't really know, but I just like that area. Okay, this is our project boat, the Swanen. She's loaned to us by one of the Swedish universities, so it's a scientific boat. One of the divers just about to get into the sea there. Basically, we've got a platform on the back, we've got a good ladder for getting up and down, really nice stable boat. This is an interesting thing here. So about 700 people were on board the Mars when she blew up, which means that about 700 sailors and soldiers went down with the Mars. What you can see here is a human femur. So this is actually a leg bone, a thigh bone from one of those people who died on the Mars. The really interesting thing in the Baltic is the bottom of the Baltic is very, very, very cold. It is 3 Celsius, 3 to 4 Celsius. So that's like 38 Fahrenheit. And there is no oxygen in the water. So there is no shipworm, there is no bacteria, nothing really grows or lives down there, which means that all of the wood and any organic matter should still be intact. So we know that about 700 people died on the ship, and we have found a grand total of 1 human bone, and that's what you can see there. So somewhere there's a lot more bones, and we don't know where they are. The whole project is a look and don't touch project. So we don't excavate at the moment. We don't move anything. We take digital documentation. So we take lots of photos, we measure things like this, but we don't touch anything because, you know, it was a big war grave. Another shot of the bone there. There's some cooking pots. So here's a small iron cooking pot, like a little 3-legged cauldron. We've got about 6 or 7 of these around the site, but we also have a couple that are maybe 2 or 3 feet in diameter, so really big ones as well. This is just a cup. This would have been a ceramic or clay pot that they would have drunk from. So again, lots of signs of the life there. Really, really, really exciting thing here. This is a silver coin. So I mentioned earlier that the Mars had a war treasury on board. So this is one of the coins from that war treasury. We haven't actually found much of the war treasury. We found about 8 coins so far. None of the gold yet. We found about 8 silver coins, but no gold yet. So we're still hunting for that as well. Here's a little sketch from one of the archaeology teams on the early days, looking at some of the sizes of some of the planks. This is very traditional archaeology, but basically the wreck is so deep, it's 250 feet deep, it's 75 meters deep, that you can't really do easily traditional archaeology on it. So we've done a lot of digital archaeology. So we have multi-beam sonar. This is where the boat basically has sonar sounders on the top, and it bounces the sonar sound off the wreck, and we get a bounce back, and it gives us a pretty good image of what the wreck looks like. So you can see here the port side, the left side of the ship. It's actually broken in half and is sat on top of the rest of the ship. You can see cannon ports sticking out, and you can also see here, some of the impacts from the cannonballs from the other ships from the battle. This is a photo mosaic. So this is a really nice way of looking at the wreck. This is 600 photos that have been stitched together. Now, one of the reasons we have to do this is that the average visibility on the wreck when we're diving it is about 5 feet. So you can't really see more than 5 feet at a time. So you'd never be able to see the wreck like this in reality. So this is a mosaic made up of 600 photos stitched together to give us this overhead view. But the thing that we've really been doing is this. This is digital 3D photogrammetry. So we now have something like 100,000 photos of this wreck. By using lots of photos and some very clever software, we stitched it together to make a 3D model of the wreck. So I'm now going to show you some images of this. I have a little video. Let's play this, and hopefully you get that through. So what you can see here is a digital reconstruction of what the wreck actually looks like in its current form. The model that we've made is actually accurate to less than a millimeter, so everything there is accurately sized and scaled less than a millimeter. You can see there a couple of the big cannon, and the diver there is shot to scale. It's a fake diver, it's a digital diver we've added into the movie. Couple of other things we did on the early days, actually recover a few bits. So we recovered one cannon cradle, one cannon barrel, and one cannon breech, although they weren't breech loading, but so the back half of cannon, and one cannon wheel. It actually turned out that when we digitally reconstructed these, the two halves of the cannon that were lifted were actually of the same cannon. So once these were lifted, we did 3D scans of them. This enabled us to basically reconstruct digitally what the cannons would have looked like. So we could put the thing back together, which is a bit hard to do when you've got 2.5 tons of cannon in reality and you don't want to damage it. So it's easily done digitally. Yeah. And that's what it would have looked like, kind of new. We recolored it to show you what it would look like. A really cool thing as well is this should be launching this year. Is an Oculus, a game from Oculus. So for the Oculus Rift and Oculus Quest platforms. So this is the virtual reality headsets. You put the headset on, and you can actually go and dive the Mars yourself. So we teamed up with a game company to develop this 3D virtual reality game, which enables you to dive around the Mars and look for artifacts yourself. And cool, so that is the end of my little presentation. Let me do that. And I'm back on. Just to mention, my background here is actually the ship of the Vasa. So the Vasa was another Swedish warship. It was built about 30 years after Mars sank. And it was named after Eric XIV's father. And the Vasa unfortunately sank outside Stockholm Harbour in about 20 feet of water, so was covered in mud for several years and has been lifted and restored in a museum in Stockholm. So that's, I thought that would be a good place to sit for this presentation.
It certainly is. Well, thank you so much, John. What a very cool talk. And the feedback on YouTube when you were showing the digital reconstruction is awesome. So just check out that chat bar. It's amazing. So we're going to dive in with questions in a minute. We've got a few live groups, and welcome in everyone. So I'll come for questions with you. If you're on YouTube, just let me know where you're joining from. I'll share as many questions as I can from there as well. And our first question to kick us off is from Brooklyn and Rain, and they want to know what the ship Mars was made of. So this whole edifice, what wood are we using? How are we building this? Okay,
yeah. So a lot of the Mars was oak. So most of it was oak, very, very, very big bits of oak. Some of the timbers are easily 3 foot by 3 foot by 100 feet long kind of territory. So, but yeah, a lot of it was oak.
Nice. Thanks, John. All right, I'm going to go to Miss Erickson joining us in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. She's got a bunch of students watching in on Google Meets. So if you want to demute your microphone and share a question with us, go for it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Patrick would like to know, how deep in the water is this ship, is Mars?
Yeah. Okay, so the Mars is about 250 feet underwater.
Yeah. And so I want to harp on this for a second, actually, John. So you have divers that are down there. How long can divers stay at 250 feet? Because that is really deep.
Yeah, it's really deep. So we limit ourselves to about to no more than 40 minutes on the wreck on any given dive. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one is, at that depth, 40 minutes of time on the bottom takes us 2 hours to reach the surface again. So we have to come up slowly. We have to do what we call decompressing, which allows gases that have absorbed into our bodies to come out safely. But the other thing is, as I said, I think it's 4 degrees Celsius, 3 to 4 degrees Celsius on the bottom. So 38 Fahrenheit, something around there. That's really, really, really cold. And so by the time you've done 40 minutes, now we have what we call dry suits. So they're rubber suits that basically don't let any water in. We have dry gloves, so they're rubber gloves that don't let water in. We have many layers of insulation under it, but all of us are also wearing electric heating. So we have electric wires running through all of that heats us up. But after 40 minutes, even with electric heating, your fingers can't bend. Like, your thumbs stop bending. So if your job is to try and take photos, which involves using your fingers, at about 40 minutes, you can't take photos anymore. So there's no point in us staying any longer.
And this is all, of course, in advance of you getting that shark submarine that you showed us in the Tintin book, because that looks awesome. So one day.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Bring it on.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to go to Laura's group in Ottawa. If you guys have a question for us, just demute your mics and come on up. Yeah, you guys. Hey, no hurry, all good. Sorry for the doll. There you go. You're good to go.
Hi, thanks so much. We were just wondering about how far you actually have to travel to get to the dive site, how long it takes you to get there.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So it takes us on the boat about 1 hour to go from the harbor where we base ourselves out to the Mars. So she's about 1 hour offshore. It's actually, the harbor is this tiny little fishing village in Sweden that we get lots and lots of visitors every year when we turn up, because we turn up with a truck full of dive gear and compressors and all this sort of stuff, and all these boats arrive, and then every day we go out. We're offshore for about 5 hours, and then we come back in again, and that's the point everyone wants to ask us. But yeah, so the ship's about an hour offshore.
Nice. Good question, guys. All right, let's go to Tanya's group in Toronto. You guys are demuted for whatever reason it worked with you. So if you have a question for us, go for it.
We have a couple. Go ahead.
How much was that ship?
How much was that special diving ship that the brothers bought for the vessel?
Okay. So how much? I honestly don't know how much Richard and his team spent on boats and side scans over the years. It could probably be measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 20-year period. The ship that actually found the Mars, the ship that they were working on, didn't belong to them. They borrowed it, but that was probably $1 million boat.
Very cool. I love hearing about the cost of certain technologies. Like, we do this with like microbiologists too, and the scanning electron microscopes for like $250,000. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
See, if you're a scientist or explorer, you get to play with some really, really cool toys. So that's incentive enough for me. All right. The Ferris family on YouTube, they want to know, did you find any art from the ship? Is there any artistry, or that could be carved stuff or whatever? Yeah.
So far, no. So far, we haven't. We know more modern ships have been very heavily decorated. So when you look at the Vasa, if you look at like the image behind me, it is a highly decorated ship, because Vasa wasn't really a warship. Vasa was a piece of art by herself. Yeah, that was her purpose, to show the wealth of the Swedish nation. If you go backwards in time further, you get to the Mary Rose. So the Mary Rose was a ship that they had a museum in the UK, and she was recovered out of Portsmouth Harbour. And the Mary Rose is not very heavily decorated. You know, the Mary Rose does not have a lot of decoration, but does have some art that was discovered inside the ship. The Mars, because we're not allowed to excavate, we haven't really been able to dig in underneath the ship to try and find the smaller artifacts. But as a ship itself is not heavily decorated. We've not found any real signs of heavy decoration on the ship. But what we are missing, we're missing the entire bow. So we're missing the front. We're missing like a third of the wreck. It doesn't exist in the wreck site. So when the explosion happened and the main mast went up, the bow obviously went. Now, whether it was completely destroyed or whether it had floated away, we don't know until we find it or, you know, carry on not finding it. But there is some thought that she might have had a figurehead. So Mars is right in that time period where maybe or maybe didn't have a figurehead. But we kind of expect that maybe she would have done. And that's one of the things that we're really hunting. There would have been, hopefully, this very large carved statuette on the front of the ship as a figurehead. And that is one of my ultimate goals as part of this project, is hopefully to try and find that and obviously find the gold.
Well, we certainly hope so for you, and your enthusiasm is infectious, John, as before. So thank you so much for all this. All right, I'm going to go to YouTube for one more, and then I'm going to come back to all our live groups for a bunch of more questions. So a great question from Shannon. How long would it take to build a ship like this?
What, for me? For
the Swedish,
the Swedish shipbuilders. It took about a year to build Mars, but you know, a lot. But that was fast for a ship. You know, back in those times, ships like this would not have been built quickly. A lot of the time they would grow the trees specifically for. Oh,
I think we can still hear you. Your video just cut out for a second. You think? Or you're entirely gone? Oh, entirely gone. Well, we'll get John back in a second. Sometimes when you're joining from across the pond, we have some connectivity difficulties. Let's send him a quick message. John, in again. I'll email him too. This is half the fun. The ghost of the Swedish warship fleet didn't want us to know how long it took to build the ship, I think is what happened there. That's my best guess. Right. But I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. I'm going to email John really quick here. And if you didn't get a chance to see John's other presentation the other week about his general dive expeditions, check that out when we're done. It's on our YouTube page. It's super cool. And you can do that again. All right. In. All right. That should work. Cool. While we're waiting for John to come back in, I've sent him a couple messages now. Marine archaeology in general. So this is something that we've barely ever covered with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. In fact, it's only been in the last 2 months or so, amidst all these COVID weird times, that we've been highlighting it. So John's other presentation is awesome. This one, we're hopefully going to be doing more with John. If not through the rest of our last 2 weeks here, then certainly come September when we dive back in headlong. I'd also encourage you to check out Mike Maloney's presentation and Matthew Eyre. So that's A-Y-R-E, but Mike Maloney, Matthew Eyre, two really, really cool talks on marine archaeology up in Canada. And so a nice compliment to what we've been learning about today with our warship. Great questions on YouTube too. So what we'll do, worst case, hopefully John's going to come back in a second. Is if he doesn't come back, if he's entirely dead and the computer's died, then I'll take questions. You guys can send me questions. I'll send them to John, and John will answer them, and we'll get those answers back to you. So I know you guys might have a few more questions, but let's hopefully get them. I'm going to just bug them one more time here. We'll see if we can get this going. I appreciate your patience. And Laura, if you're joining us for the first time, this does not usually happen, I promise. 1 in like 70 or so. Oh, I think he's back. John's back. See? I have faith in John. John, you're here. Hey, John.
I hate computers. Oh, hello. All sorts of weird.
Like,
oh,
you look like one of those Pirates of the Caribbean things. You're like melding into stuff. You got zombies.
Yeah, that's not quite what's supposed to be going on.
Got actual zombies with you.
Oh, yeah. That's
ghostly. Now there's zombies in your face. This is
in my face. Yeah. Give me a second. Let me see that. No, something really weird has gone on with my computer.
This is a new one for us. This has never happened before.
This is very bizarre. Let me. Oh, good.
I can always turn off your video so that you're not a weird spectral ghost man. Oh, that's cool.
Is that's working? No.
Now you're a Spectral Ghost Man in the corner.
I'm still a Spectral Ghost Man with the zombies in the background. I don't know where the zombies are coming from.
Come early.
Yeah.
You didn't need to wait until October 31st. We're here.
You know what? Let's
kill your video and we'll just do audio. That's okay.
Yeah, there we go. Videos. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll just do audio. You just you turn me off and.
So here, I'll kill.
In fact,
now you're in front of zombies. Now
I'm now in front of the zombies. How is it doing that? How is it doing that?
I am so looking forward to this recording. So this is going to be on YouTube forever now.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. There we go. That's what's going on. Apparently, I have a virtual background in Zoom with zombies. Where does that come from?
I've never seen it. Hey, you're Aurora now.
That'll do. We're good. We'll go with that. That's good.
Okay. I think we were just finishing up the question of how long it takes to build a ship.
Right, there we go. Yeah. So
longer, yeah.
So Mars Mars took about a year, just over a year to build, I think. But normally in this time they'd grow the trees specifically for a given ship. So it might be 50 or 60 years before the ship was built from the point that they decided they were going to build it. Yeah, you'd have to grow the oak. In the case of Mars, it was done very quickly, and basically King Eric just went out into Sweden and went, right, give us all your oak, give us everything you need. Let's build this ship. And one of the things we've actually found as the dive team, because of how it blew up and the front came off the wreck, some of it's broken. And we've started seeing some of the engineering of some of the bits of the ship, where traditionally it was expected that you just have single large pieces of oak doing it. And we've actually found that it's several pieces of oak that have been joined together and then like laminated in order to make the ship. So that's kind of cool in itself.
Very cool. I love the story of melting down all the church bells too. I would die to see some written records of what all the clerics thought of that. We'll cover that in another presentation, but we'll dive in with a few more questions with our live groups. I'm going to go to Laura, Tanya, and then 2 from Miss Erickson. Okay, so Laura, if you want to come up, just mute your mic again and go for it.
All right, would you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
So you said you found like some coin. What like other stuff or treasures would you find there?
So what we found so far, we found a few silver coins. We're looking for the gold coins. There should be a lot of gold on there as well, but not really much other treasure as such. What we've been finding is a lot of artifacts from the crew. So things like the cooking pots, things like the cups and stuff that they eat and drink from. One of the things that we still haven't really found anything of yet is the hand weaponry. So we haven't found any swords, we've not found any spears or halberts or any of that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what we're really hunting from. But at one place we have found, it's kind of interesting, it's a pewter plate. So it's about this kind of diameter, but it's embedded in one of the bits of oak. So it was obviously the explosion that sunk Mars was so big that it fired this plate into one of these oak planks, and that's kind of up in the top of the ship, like underneath one of the bits of the ship, which was kind of really weird. We'd dived through that area several times before someone spotted it, and it's because most of the time when you're a diver, you can kind of look down easily. You don't really look up above you very easily. But this one time, someone was kind of taking a photo at an odd angle and just spotted it up there. So, yeah.
Awesome, John. I was going to follow up on that on something. Oh, a quick follow up on this for kids that are like, have like visions of tons of wealth in their head. If you find all this gold, John, do you get to keep it personally? Are you just like a billionaire or not?
No, no. It all immediately goes back to the Swedish government. We are very lucky that we dive under license from the Swedish government on there. We're the only dive team who have the license. So the rest of the time there is a 1 mile exclusion zone around the wreck where boats aren't even allowed to stop. So as part of that is all the fines automatically belong to the Swedish government. Anything we find.
That is a good thing, but also, of course, that is the answer. All right, let's go to Tanya's group. If you guys have a question, come on up.
Can I do something?
No, it's Odie's turn. Go ahead, sir.
I have 2 questions.
You can. Let's ask the 2 then. Go for it, man.
Yeah.
How many cannonballs were on the ship when it got sunk?
And what's the second one? Let's do them both at the same time.
how many, I mean, was there any weapons aside from cannons?
Yeah, so any weapons aside from cannons, John,
Okay.
and how many cannonballs will be on the ship?
Yeah.
Great questions.
Okay, so were there any weapons aside from the cannons? So in terms of the ship itself, she had like 122 cannon. So some of them were massive, 15, 16 feet long. Some of them were 4 or 5 feet long, what we call cannonettes. That kind of size. So and some of these would have actually been mounted on the top, kind of on spigots. So they'd almost be a bit like a very large rifle, but cannon. There would definitely have been swords. There would definitely have been pikes and kind of spears. We haven't found any kind of muskets or anything yet, but we would expect in this time period some of them to have had muskets as well, so small arms. So that bit's an easy answer. In terms of how many cannonballs, I don't know. I mean, 122 cannon, you're probably going to load at least 100 cannonballs per cannon. So we're looking at 12,000 or so cannonballs, maybe something like that. You can't easily kind of sail back to harbour to restock. So if you're going to sail into a battle, you want to be loaded up with as much cannonballs and as much black powder, gunpowder as you can. So, but they're really cool questions, actually. Really cool.
Yeah, fantastic, guys. All right, one quick YouTube question. I'll come to Ms. Erickson. A question from YouTube. What color was the ship? Do we know if it was painted in any ceremonial colors or anything like that, or not?
We don't really know, and this is one of the issues that we have, that there's no paintings of the Mars done when Mars existed. So there's some paintings and drawings and stuff done of Mars many years after Mars sunk. So these will basically have been from kind of imagination. There was something, I remember one of the archaeologists at one point mentioning that she might have had red sails, but we don't know. There's certainly no sign of paint that we found so far on the wood. So I suspect that mostly she would have just been the original oak, but there may well have been painted sections. So we don't know.
Fantastic. All right, I'm going to go to Ms. Erickson for one more question. If you want to wrap us up, come on up and mute your mic and go for it.
All right, I have 2 questions from Annabelle. She would like to know if there were many rooms on the ship, if you knew, like how many rooms would be on the ship. And her second question was the king on the ship when it sunk?
Okay, so the second question is very easy. The king was not on the Mars when she sunk. Kings tended not actually to bother going into battle. They would send their navies and their admirals in to do that job for them, because naval battles were a pretty good way of ending up not still around. So the king stayed in Sweden. So that bit's easy. In terms of rooms, yes. So rooms on the ship are kind of an interesting concept at this time. We know for sure that Mars had 2 full cannon deck. So that means that she had 2 decks that ran all the way from the bow to the stern that were full of cannons. So 2 decks, and then the top deck, which also had cannon on board. And in the forecastle and the bow and the stern castle, so these would have been the kind of at the front and the back of any of these ships, they would come up a couple of decks higher at the front and the back. So we know that there would have been rooms in those castles at the front and the back of the ship. So at the back would have been the admiral's cabin, the captain's cabin, probably the officer's mess. And in the front, there probably would have been the junior officers and the junior officers' mess. And then below deck, there wouldn't really have been much in the way of rooms. There might have been small compartments for certain people, like the surgeon, like the shipwright. But generally, the rest of it was just one big space for the cannon decks. Because basically, once it's fighting and those cannon are firing and coming in and out, there's no space for walls, and walls are just going to get in the way.
John, this has been such a thrill, and we are almost out of time. So what I want to do is a last message is, where can kids and people joining this learn more about the Mars Project?
Yes, absolutely. So the best place to learn more about it is the Mars Project's website, which is www.mars-project.org. Unfortunately, obviously, NASA have their own Mars Project, which is a slightly different Mars. So if you Google Mars Project, all you get is stuff about sending astronauts to Mars. which is really cool. I love that as well. But if you want to find our Mars, then either Google for Mars Rec or www.mars-project.org.
Fantastic. I have linked that into the chat bar. I'm going to send an email to all our live groups as well. And for everyone tuning in on YouTube, you can check that out in the chat bar. It's a fantastic thing. You can learn so much more. I can't wait to do the Oculus project and see this live. I am chomping at the bit almost as much as my Shark sub, which is very cool. So what we do at the end of every program, John, is I'm going to demute everyone's microphones, or if our families can demute their own microphones. So Tanya's group, Laura's group, Ms. Erickson, if you guys could join me in saying a huge thank you to John for joining us today. Let's just demute everyone and go for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was amazing.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
This was amazing. This was a lot of fun. We even had like weird zombie head stuff.
I know.
Like, extra spice to the talk. John, we just really appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us. We look so forward to having more presentations on all the cool dive stuff you've done. And I hope everyone will check out our Mars project when we finish up the broadcast.
Excellent. Thank you for having me again.
See you later, everyone. Have a nice